The unforgiving sun beat down upon the sprawling Silas plantation, a relentless golden hammer driving heat into the parched earth. Dust motes danced like tormented spirits in the oppressive air, clinging to every leaf, every threadbare garment, every bead of sweat that trickled down a furrowed brow. It was another scorching afternoon, indistinguishable from countless others, yet marked by a profound, guttural sorrow that ripped through the very fabric of the community. A young boy, Samuel, barely 7 years old, stood amidst a cluster of weeping men and women, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs or stifled cries. His small frame was unnervingly still, a stark contrast to the emotional maelstrom swirling around him. All eyes, brimming with tears and despair, were fixed on the same tragic spectacle. A woman named Sarah, her once vibrant headscarf askew, her slender wrists bound, being brutally led away. Sarah's cries were not for herself, not truly. They were raw, desperate pleas for her child, a sound that tore at the soul, echoing across the sun-baked fields and ricocheting off the whitewashed walls of the main house. "My baby, please, my baby," she shrieked, her voice hoarse, cracking with an agony no mother should ever know. Her feet dragged reluctantly through the dust, each step a battle against the invisible chains that already bound her future. Mr. Silas, the plantation owner, a portly man with a florid face and eyes as cold as river stones, barked orders from the shade of the veranda, his voice devoid of any discernible empathy, a harsh, unfeeling instrument of commerce. "Move her along, we haven't all day. The trader has other stops to make." The words were a dismissal, not just of Sarah, but of her very humanity, of the sacred bond she shared with her child. Samuel, however, did not weep. He did not cry out. His small face, smudged with dirt, remained remarkably calm, an almost unsettling mask of composure amidst the chaos. His eyes, dark and deep like ancient wells, absorbed every single detail with a chilling precision that belied his tender age. He noted the exact shade of the torn fabric on Sarah's threadbare dress, a faded blue that had once been vibrant. He registered the calloused, rough hands of the slave trader, their fingers digging into Sarah's arm, leaving angry red welts. He heard the precise clink of coins exchanged, the specific cold calculation of human worth reduced to currency. He remembered Mr. Silas's exact words of dismissal, the casual cruelty of them, the way they seemed to hang in the air, heavy and poisonous, long after the sound had faded. This was not indifference. It was something far more profound, an almost preternatural focus. While others openly grieved, their pain a visible, visceral outpouring, Samuel's stillness was profound, a strategic calm. It was a coping mechanism, perhaps, forged in the crucible of overwhelming trauma, a way to transform the unbearable into something that could be held, contained, and most importantly, remembered. His young mind, though still developing, was becoming a pristine ledger, automatically inscribing every agonizing detail, every stolen name, every shattered hope into its indelible pages. The immediate consequence of Sarah's departure was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but profoundly significant for Samuel. He did not join the other children in their quiet huddle of fear, nor did he seek comfort from a parent. Instead, he retreated to a quiet corner near the edge of the cotton field, where the shadows of the tall plants offered a sliver of respite from the sun. With a slender stick he had found, he began to meticulously trace patterns in the loose, reddish dirt, a silent, almost ritualistic act of internalizing the loss. Each line, each curve, each geometric shape was a silent testament, a new entry being added to his burgeoning secret mental catalog of the disappeared. He was not merely playing, he was recording, processing, solidifying the memory. Mr. Silas, from his vantage point on the veranda, occasionally glanced at the quiet boy, seeing nothing more than an unremarkable child, perhaps a little too withdrawn, but certainly no cause for concern. He was utterly oblivious to the unique, terrifying gift that simmered beneath Samuel's calm exterior, the quiet power that was slowly, meticulously accumulating within the boy's mind. Little did the master know, The silent boy was not merely witnessing their cruelty. He was building a meticulous archive of their every transgression, one soul at a time. Each tear shed, each whispered prayer, each forced separation was not lost to the winds of time, but carefully, perfectly preserved within Samuel. The weight of this burden, the sacred trust of these memories, was immense, a silent promise etched into his very being. After a long moment, his stick fell from his grasp, forgotten in the dirt. Samuel slowly looked up, his gaze sweeping across the vast, oppressive sky, a canvas of endless blue that seemed to mock the confined lives beneath it. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark eyes, a nascent resolve, a silent promise, a terrifying, unwritten future. The true weight of his extraordinary gift, and the profound impact it would ultimately have on the lives of everyone on the Silas plantation, remained a terrifying, yet inevitable, secret waiting to unfold. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. The Silas Plantation, a vast expanse of land carved from the unforgiving earth of the deep American South, pulsed with a relentless, brutal rhythm. From the first blush of dawn, when the sky was still a bruised purple, until the last whisper of twilight faded into the oppressive black, the fields were a stage for unceasing toil. Cotton, the king and tyrant of this realm, dictated every heartbeat, every aching muscle, every drop of sweat that mingled with the dust. Rows upon endless rows of the white, fluffy fiber stretched to the horizon, a deceptive symbol of purity masking the profound suffering it cultivated. The air itself seemed heavy with the scent of damp soil, raw cotton, and the unspoken anxieties of those forced to harvest it. Life in the slave quarters was a stark contrast to the sprawling grandeur of the master's house. Small, rudimentary cabins, huddled together like weary souls seeking solace, offered little respite from the elements or the ever-present threat of the overseer's lash. Meals were meager, sleep often disturbed by the cries of infants or the distant howls of dogs, and every waking moment was governed by the rigid hierarchy enforced by Mr. Silas. His overseers, men with eyes like flint and hearts to match, stalked the fields, their whips a constant reminder of their authority. Drivers, often enslaved men themselves, were forced into the unenviable position of mediating between the master's demands and the survival of their own people, a tightrope walk fraught with peril and moral compromise. Yet amidst this crushing reality, a vibrant, resilient culture thrived in the shadowed corners of the community. In hushed tones after the day's backbreaking labor, stories were shared, weaving a tapestry of ancestral wisdom, defiant hope, and whispered memories of those stolen away. Spirituals, sung low and mournfully, carried messages of faith and freedom across the dark fields, their melodies a balm to wounded souls. Familial bonds, though constantly imperiled by the threat of sale, were fiercely cherished, strengthened by shared burdens and acts of quiet, profound love. Samuel's own mother, a woman named Alara, embodied this quiet strength. Her hands, calloused from years in the fields, were gentle when they stroked his hair, and her eyes, though often weary, held a deep protective love that was his anchor in a tumultuous world. She taught him the names of medicinal plants, the rhythm of the seasons, and the importance of keeping one's spirit free, even when the body was bound. It was within this crucible of suffering and resilience that Samuel's unique gift began to manifest. From his earliest years, even before he could fully articulate his thoughts, his memory was an anomaly. It wasn't merely a photographic recall of faces or events, but an eidetic capacity that absorbed every sensory detail, the particular timbre of a voice, the precise scent of rain on dry earth, the exact shade of light filtering through the cabin door at dawn. He remembered the feel of his mother's rough fingers braiding his hair, the taste of wild berries picked from the forest's edge, the specific pattern of cracks in the clay floor. Initially, it was a source of childlike wonder, a private world of vivid sensory replay. But as he grew, and as the harsh realities of the plantation began to etch themselves into his consciousness, this gift transformed into an immense, often unbearable burden. Every tear shed, every scream stifled, every forced separation became an indelible entry in his mind, complete with the exact date, time, and the chilling indifference in the eyes of the men who orchestrated the cruelty. He saw the world in excruciating detail, and the world he saw was filled with pain. Mr. Silas, a man of imposing stature and an air of self-importance, viewed himself as a benevolent master. He often spoke of the care he provided, the order he maintained, and the guidance he offered his enslaved population. Yet his actions consistently betrayed a profound lack of empathy, a chilling detachment from the human cost of his prosperity. His benevolence was a fragile veneer, easily shattered by economic pressures or a perceived challenge to his authority. He was dismissive of the enslaved, seeing them as property, tools for his wealth rather than individuals with souls and families. While he paid little attention to the quiet boy Samuel, a subtle unease sometimes flickered in his eyes when Samuel was present during a particularly callous transaction. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the boy's unnervingly calm, watchful demeanor, his silent absorption of every detail, seemed to cast an unspoken shadow over his actions. Samuel was always there, a still small figure on the periphery, his gaze unwavering, his presence an unsettling, unarticulated judgment. The master, in his self-delusion, simply dismissed it as a child's curiosity, utterly oblivious to the meticulous, damning archive being constructed, one soul at a time, within that quiet boy's mind. The sprawling Silas Plantation was not merely a collection of fields and dwellings. It was a monument to generations of calculated cruelty, a grim testament to a legacy built on the relentless exploitation of human lives. The roots of this conflict ran deep, twisting back to the very first Silas who had staked his claim on this fertile southern soil, seeing not land, but opportunity, and not people, but property. Each successive generation had inherited not just the acreage and the wealth, but also the deeply entrenched ideology that justified their dominion. They had started with vague, self-serving notions of civilizing the savage, but over decades, these justifications had calcified into a cold, hard belief in their inherent right to profit from the suffering of others. The wealth that flowed into the Silas coffers, visible in the grand, albeit decaying, manor house and the well-maintained fences, was directly proportional to the tears shed and the sweat poured by those forced to labor under the unforgiving sun. This was the dark heritage that Mr. Silas, the current master, had inherited, and it was a legacy he seemed determined to uphold, even expand with a chilling lack of introspection. Samuel, still a boy, but with eyes that held the wisdom of an ancient soul, continued to absorb every detail of this brutal inheritance. His internal ledger, once a nascent curiosity, was now expanding at an alarming rate, filled with the specific, painful entries of lives disrupted and families severed. He remembered the sale of little Ilara, barely a year old, taken from her mother's arms because her small size made her easier to transport. Words that still echoed with a nauseating clarity in Samuel's mind. He had seen the trader, a man with a perpetually stained waistcoat, haggle over her price as if she were a sack of grain. And Mr. Silas, with a dismissive wave, had finalized the transaction for $300, a figure Samuel would never forget. Then there was old Tobias, his back bowed from decades in the cotton fields, declared unproductive at the age of 62. Samuel recalled the exact tremor in Tobias's voice as he pleaded to stay, and the callous reply from Mr. Silas, "Sentiment doesn't fill my barns, old man." Tobias had been sent to a sugar plantation further south, a place known for its brutal conditions, and Samuel could still visualize the dusty, lonely road he was forced down, the precise route etched into his mind. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic, relentless pattern of exploitation, a continuous cycle of buying and selling that defined life on the Silas plantation. The cumulative pain of the community, a heavy blanket of shared grief, settled deep within Samuel, and he absorbed it all with a silent, perfect precision, each memory a new, indelible mark on his soul. Samuel's family, especially his mother, had long since grown acutely aware of his unique memory. They didn't understand its full scope, but they saw the way he remembered things, the small details others forgot. They would try to shield him from the worst of the sales, pulling him into the quarters when a trader came, but Samuel's watchful eyes always found a way to witness. Over time, they began, almost inadvertently, to rely on his ability. "Samuel, do you remember what day little Martha was taken?" his mother might ask, her voice a hushed whisper, a desperate plea for a fragment of the past. Or, "Did Elias have that scar on his cheek when he left?" Samuel would answer, quietly, precisely, providing the details, the dates, the circumstances, bringing back a vivid, painful clarity to their lost loved ones. He became the unofficial, living archive of the enslaved community's history, the keeper of their stolen kin. This unspoken role deepened his introspective nature, burdening him with an immense responsibility, a silent promise to remember for all of them, to hold their fragmented pasts together. He felt the weight of every name, every face, every broken promise, each one a thread connecting him to the collective suffering, a silent vow that their losses would not vanish into the cruel winds of forgetfulness. Mr. Silas, meanwhile, continued his slow, inexorable descent into moral decay. The early dismissiveness had hardened into a callous indifference, and now, a palpable cruelty. Samuel observed, with his unerring memory, the concrete examples of this escalation. There was the harvest of 38, a particularly lean year, when Silas, facing economic pressures, had reneged on his promise to keep families together. He had sworn to Eliza that her young son, Thomas, would not be sold, a promise Samuel had heard with his own ears, the exact words like a brand. Yet a month later, Thomas was gone, sold to cover a debt, and Silas had merely shrugged, muttering about hard times. Then came the new, harsher punishments for minor infractions, extra hours in the fields under the scorching midday sun, meager rations reduced further, or the public lashing of a young man named Caleb for daring to look tired. These actions were driven not just by economic desperation, but by a hardening of Silas's own conscience, a deliberate closing off of any remaining empathy. Each broken promise, each new brutality, each act of dehumanization was meticulously noted in Samuel's internal ledger, building, brick by painful brick, a damning, irrefutable case against the master, a silent indictment that would one day demand reckoning. The boy, who remembered everything, was slowly becoming the architect of Silas's inevitable downfall. The heavy blanket of shared grief that settled deep within Samuel only grew thicker, more suffocating, as the years pressed on. The initial shock of individual sales gave way to a pervasive, grinding despair that seeped into the very soil of the Silas plantation. Daily indignities, once merely painful, began to feel like deliberate acts of erasure, designed to chip away at the very essence of human worth. The casual dismissal of their suffering became routine, a cold, unfeeling aspect of the master's temperament. Mr. Silas would walk through the fields, his gaze sweeping over the bent backs of the enslaved, seeing only units of labor, never the families torn apart, the dreams deferred, the spirits slowly crushed. Arbitrary assignments of grueling tasks, like clearing rocky new ground under the scorching sun for days on end, served no practical purpose beyond asserting absolute control, a cruel reminder of their powerlessness. The constant, gnawing threat of separation hung in the air like a noxious fog, turning every shared meal, every whispered song, every moment of familial warmth into a fragile, potentially fleeting memory. Hope, once a flickering ember in the darkest corners of the quarters, slowly, agonizingly eroded, replaced by a dull ache of resignation that threatened to consume them all. Each sunrise brought not a promise of a new day, but a weary acceptance of another cycle of toil and terror, another step deeper into the abyss of lost dignity. Samuel, now a young adolescent, felt this collective despair not as an abstract concept, but as a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The names and faces in his internal ledger, once a manageable, albeit painful collection, now grew exponentially, a vast, silent congregation of the wronged. Each new entry was a fresh wound, each remembered detail a sharp shard of glass embedded deeper into his soul. He carried the burden of their stolen pasts, the unfulfilled futures, the silent screams of those dragged away. The simmering anger of those around him, often expressed in hushed tones or knowing glances, resonated deeply within his own burgeoning sense of injustice. He saw the way his mother's shoulders sagged a little more each year, the lines of worry etched deeper into his grandmother's face, the fear in the eyes of the younger children. The immense weight of these memories, the raw, undeniable evidence of systemic cruelty, ignited a powerful, almost unbearable urge to speak out, to shatter the suffocating silence with the truth. Yet, a colder, more rational part of him, honed by years of observation, understood the immense danger such an act would pose. The plantation was a tinderbox, and a single spark, no matter how righteous, could consume everything he held dear. He wrestled with this internal conflict daily, the moral imperative clashing with the instinct for self-preservation, the desire for justice battling the fear of annihilation. The ledger was a weapon, but one that could easily backfire, destroying the very people it was meant to protect. Mr. Silas, oblivious to the profound internal world of the quiet boy who watched him, continued to refine his manipulative tactics. His cruelty was not always overt. Sometimes it was far more insidious, cloaked in a veneer of feigned benevolence. He might, for instance, grant a small, seemingly generous favor, a day of rest for a particularly exhausted field hand, or a slightly larger ration of meat after a good harvest, only to follow it with an act of profound cruelty that would negate any fleeting goodwill. He understood the power of division, subtly pitting enslaved individuals against each other, rewarding informants or sowing seeds of distrust through rumors and false promises. He would often make grand, empty pronouncements about his Christian duty or his care for his people, promising to keep families together, to provide better housing, or to ease their burdens, knowing full well he had no intention of honoring these words. Samuel observed these patterns with chilling clarity, his memory recording not just the words spoken, but the calculated deceit behind them. He saw how Silas would use fear as a blunt instrument, but also how he wielded hope as a delicate, poisonous lure, dangling it just out of reach, only to snatch it away when it served his purpose. The boy understood the insidious nature of Silas's power, how it warped not just the lives of the enslaved, but the very soul of the master himself. He was building a detailed psychological profile of his oppressor, a blueprint of his weaknesses and his malevolent strategies. While Samuel kept the full extent of his extraordinary gift a secret, the other enslaved people on the plantation began, subtly, to sense his unique capacity for remembrance. It wasn't something spoken aloud, not directly, but an understanding that passed between them in glances, in hushed tones, in the way they would seek him out. His quiet presence at every sale, his unnervingly knowing gaze that seemed to absorb every detail, every emotion, every word exchanged, made him an unspoken repository of their collective grief and history. When an elder would struggle to recall the exact year a cousin was sold, or the name of a child taken away decades ago, they would sometimes turn to Samuel, not directly asking him to remember, but speaking of the lost ones in his presence, as if his very proximity might conjure the details. And Samuel, in his quiet way, would often provide the missing piece, a date, a description, a specific word spoken, that others had long since forgotten. He became a living testament to their stolen past, a silent promise that their losses, their pain, their very existence would not be swallowed whole by the relentless march of time or the master's deliberate amnesia. He was the keeper of their shared narrative, the silent archivist who held the fragile threads of their identity together, a beacon of memory in a world designed to forget. The promise of a bountiful harvest had withered under a relentless drought, turning the verdant fields of the Silas plantation into cracked, dusty expanses. What little cotton did emerge was thin, brittle, and commanded a pitiful price at market. Mr. Silas, never a man of foresight, had made a series of ill-advised investments, speculating on lands he couldn't afford and equipment that proved faulty. The financial difficulties, once a simmering undercurrent, now roared like a flash flood, threatening to sweep away everything he believed he owned. This desperation twisted Silas further, hardening the last vestiges of human decency within him. He became a man consumed by panic and rage, lashing out with increasing ferocity. The threats of more sales, once reserved for the most grievous offenses, became a daily pronouncement, hanging heavy in the air like the humid summer heat. He implemented stricter, often brutal measures to extract more labor from the already exhausted enslaved community. Rations were cut to barely sustainable levels. Workdays stretched from before dawn until long after dusk, and the whips of the overseers cracked with renewed, merciless vigor. The pressure on the enslaved community intensified dramatically, each sunrise bringing with it a fresh wave of fear and uncertainty. Every creak of a wagon wheel, every distant barking dog sent a jolt of terror through the quarters, the constant dread of separation, a dull ache in every heart. Silas's eyes, once merely dismissive, now held a frantic, desperate glint, a reflection of his crumbling world, and he saw his human property not as individuals, but as commodities to be squeezed dry, their suffering an unfortunate but necessary cost of his survival. He paced the veranda, a gaunt, restless figure, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the parched earth, a harbinger of the escalating cruelty he was about to unleash. The very air vibrated with unspoken dread, a suffocating premonition of the brutal measures yet to come, designed to stave off his own ruin at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. Beyond the boundaries of the Silas plantation, the world was beginning to notice. The close-knit, albeit stratified society of the Southern planters operated on a delicate balance of reputation and perceived competence. While the inherent cruelty of slavery was rarely questioned, there were unspoken codes of conduct, a performative veneer of benevolence that many masters maintained, if only for appearances. Mr. Silas, in his escalating desperation, was shredding that veneer. Neighboring plantation owners, during infrequent visits or chance encounters in town, observed his increasingly erratic and cruel behavior. The once proud Silas manor was falling into disrepair, a physical manifestation of its owner's decline. Whispers circulated through hushed drawing rooms and bustling market squares. "Silas is losing his grip," they'd murmur. "Works his people too hard. Sells too many. No stability there." Overseers from other plantations who occasionally interacted with Silas's men reported stories of unprovoked beatings, of children sold without a second thought, of families torn apart with a casual ruthlessness that even hardened men found disturbing. While direct intervention was rare, the social judgments were palpable. Silas found himself subtly isolated within his own social sphere. Invitations to supper became less frequent, nods of recognition in town grew colder, and the usual network of credit and favors began to dry up. These judgments, though silent and delivered through sidelong glances and clipped conversations, contributed to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that enveloped the Silas estate. He was becoming a pariah, not for owning slaves, but for failing to perform the role of a proper master, for allowing his desperation to strip away even the pretense of humanity. The weight of these unspoken condemnations pressed down on him, fueling his paranoia, and further isolating him from any potential counsel or restraint. The community, in its own way, was turning its back, leaving Silas to stew in his own bitter brew of self-made ruin and escalating tyranny, a man increasingly alone in his spiraling descent. Samuel, now a young man on the cusp of adulthood, felt the intensified pressure like a physical weight. The constant threats, the renewed brutality, the gaunt faces of his people, all hammered home the urgency of his silent burden. For years, his memory had been a sacred secret archive, a silent promise to those taken. But as fear intensified, as his community frayed under Silas's escalating madness, Samuel's understanding of his gift shifted profoundly. It was no longer enough to merely remember. Remembrance alone offered no solace, no protection from injustice. He began to see his perfect recall not just as a record, but as a weapon for justice, a tool that could cut through the darkness. His mind, already a vast repository of names, dates, and transactions, now processed information with a new, strategic intent. He observed Silas's patterns, the routines of traders, the subtle hierarchies among overseers, the specific vulnerabilities in the system. He started to formulate a silent plan, a complex strategy woven from years of meticulous observation. This wasn't impulsive, but a slow, agonizing crystallization of purpose, born from his people's suffering and his unique capacity. He found subtle ways to verify fragments of his knowledge, listening intently to hushed conversations, cross-referencing details with his internal ledger. He sought out trusted elders, not revealing the full extent of his gift, but asking carefully phrased questions to confirm dates or names, piecing together the larger, damning mosaic. His quiet demeanor, once seen as shyness, now masked a fierce, burgeoning resolve. The boy who remembered everything was transforming from a passive archivist into an active architect of truth, preparing to unleash his memory's devastating power. The psychological environment on the Silas plantation had become unbearable, a heavy, suffocating blanket of despair. Communal singing, once a source of defiant hope, grew muted, often replaced by quiet weeping or the tense silence of suppressed fear. Hope, a fragile flame, dwindled to a barely perceptible ember, threatened by relentless cruelty. Resentment, sharp and bitter, simmered beneath the surface, occasionally boiling over in small, desperate acts of sabotage or fleeting defiance, swiftly and brutally crushed. A pervasive sense of impending doom settled over the quarters, a grim certainty that more heartbreak was always just around the corner. Every interaction with an overseer, every glimpse of Silas, was fraught with tension, a tightrope walk between survival and punishment. Yet amidst this crushing atmosphere, Samuel's presence, though still largely silent, took on unsettling significance. To the enslaved community, his quiet, watchful demeanor became a source of both comfort and grim understanding. They knew he remembered, even if they didn't know how or why. He was their living testament, their unspoken history. To Mr. Silas, however, Samuel's unwavering gaze, his almost unnerving stillness, began to disturb him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Silas would catch the boy's eyes across a field, or see him standing silently by the blacksmith's forge, and an inexplicable chill would run down his spine. He couldn't pinpoint why, but Samuel's presence felt like a constant, unsettling reminder of his own actions, a silent judgment that burrowed deep into his increasingly frayed conscience. The boy was a shadow that followed him, a silent witness to every transgression, every broken promise, every act of cruelty. The plantation, already a powder keg of human suffering and desperation, was now primed, its atmosphere thick with fear and the unspoken promise of an explosion. Samuel, with his meticulously compiled mental ledger, held the match, waiting for the precise, inevitable moment to strike. The weight of Silas's accumulating sins pressed down on the plantation, a suffocating blanket woven from broken promises and shattered lives. The harvest of 41 was disastrous, blight decimating the cotton crop, and Silas, teetering on the brink of financial ruin, became increasingly volatile. His gaze, once merely dismissive, now held a desperate, feverish glint, a predatory hunger that sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned field hands. He started selling off livestock, tools, anything he could to stave off the inevitable collapse, but the hole in his finances was too vast. Then came the threats. Whispers carried on the wind spoke of selling off entire families, of breaking up the remaining semblance of community. Samuel heard Silas in the main house, his voice booming through the open windows, arguing with his overseer, Mr. Johnson. "I have no choice, Johnson. These people are assets, and I need to liquidate. I'll sell them south to the sugar plantations. They'll fetch a good price there." The thought of being sold south was a horrifying prospect, tales of unimaginable cruelty echoing in the slave quarters. It was a fate worse than death, a permanent severing from everything they knew, a descent into an abyss of suffering. Silas, in his desperate scramble, began making increasingly erratic and cruel decisions. He publicly berated old Mama Rose, the matriarch of the community, accusing her of laziness and inefficiency, despite her years of tireless service. He threatened to sell her to a breeder, a fate that would have been particularly cruel given her age. Samuel watched, his face an impassive mask, as Mama Rose, her back ramrod straight despite her age, simply stared back at Silas, her eyes filled with a quiet dignity that seemed to unnerve even the master. That night, Samuel overheard his mother weeping softly, her body shaking with silent sobs. "He's going to sell us, Samuel, I know it. He'll sell us all." Samuel's patience, stretched thin over years of witnessing injustice, finally reached its breaking point. The threat to his mother, to Mama Rose, to the very fabric of his community, ignited a fire within him, a burning resolve that could no longer be contained. The silent archivist, the meticulous recorder of wrongs, was about to become something more, a catalyst for change. The weight of his memories, the faces, the names, the dates, the specific cruelties, became a weapon, a tool for liberation. He could no longer stand idly by, a passive observer in the face of such blatant evil. He had to act. He had been subtly preparing for this moment, almost unconsciously, for years. He had observed the patterns of Silas's behavior, the weaknesses in his facade, the moments of vulnerability when his carefully constructed mask of superiority slipped. He had also been subtly testing the waters within the community, gauging who he could trust, who shared his simmering anger, who would be willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. He had found a few, a small core of trusted individuals who understood the power of his memory, who saw in him a glimmer of hope. He started by subtly verifying his information, sharing small, seemingly insignificant details with these trusted confidants. "Do you remember when Thomas was sold? It was the third Tuesday in July, wasn't it?" he would ask casually. When they confirmed his accuracy, their eyes would widen with a mixture of awe and understanding. He was building trust, demonstrating the undeniable truth of his gift, laying the foundation for what was to come. He knew he couldn't reveal the full extent of his memory, not yet. It was too dangerous. But he could plant seeds of doubt, sow the seeds of rebellion, prepare the ground for a harvest of justice. He noticed that Silas was becoming increasingly paranoid, isolating himself from even his most loyal overseers. He suspected that the master sensed something was brewing, a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle undercurrent of resistance. Silas's eyes would often linger on Samuel, a flicker of unease in their depths, as if he sensed the boy held a secret, a hidden power that threatened his carefully constructed world. The narrative builds with an almost unbearable tension. It is clear that something momentous is about to happen, that Samuel's years of silent observation are about to erupt in a volcanic display of truth. The plantation, already a pressure cooker of resentment and fear, is on the verge of exploding, and Samuel, the quiet boy who remembers everything, is about to light the fuse. The air crackles with anticipation. The moment is close. The moment arrived with the harsh clang of the plantation gate, an unexpected and unwelcome interruption to the oppressive mid-morning heat. A grand carriage rumbled up the dusty lane, drawing every eye. From it emerged Mr. Elias Thorne, a representative from a prominent Northern Abolitionist society, accompanied by a local county magistrate. They had received disturbing reports, Thorne stated with quiet conviction, concerning the appalling treatment of the enslaved people on the Silas plantation, and they were there to conduct a thorough inquiry. Mr. Silas, taken by surprise, his face a mask of barely concealed fury and panic, stammered a welcome, attempting to maintain a facade of benign control, even as his world threatened to unravel. He tried to dismiss the allegations as baseless rumors, but Thorne's gaze remained unwavering. Silas, ever the showman, though now desperate, attempted to orchestrate a controlled tour, guiding the visitors away from the dilapidated cabins. He spoke of his laborers' contentment and the care he provided. But Samuel, observing from the shadows of the cotton gin, saw his opportunity. This was the opening he had waited for, the external witness. With quiet determination that belied his young age, he stepped out, his eyes fixed intently on the magistrate and Mr. Thorne. A hush fell. Silas, seeing Samuel, blanched, a primal fear flashing in his eyes, instinctively understanding the danger the boy represented. "Sir," Samuel began, his voice surprisingly clear, though tinged with profound emotion, "Mr. Silas speaks of contentment, but he forgets the faces of those who are gone." The words hung, potent and disarming. Thorne and the magistrate turned their full attention to Samuel. Silas, visibly agitated, bellowed, "Boy, get back to your work." The silence that followed Samuel's torrent of truth was not empty. It was a vacuum, sucking the very air from the room, leaving everyone breathless. Mr. Silas, caught in the unforgiving spotlight of Samuel's memory, stood utterly exposed. His face, usually a mask of haughty indifference or feigned benevolence, contorted into a grotesque display of disbelief, then fury, and finally, a chilling, primal fear. The names Samuel had recited, each one a shard of a shattered life, echoed in the sudden stillness, dismantling Silas's carefully constructed narrative of a benevolent master with every precise detail. The visiting official, a stern-faced man named Mr. Caldwell from the Northern Abolitionist Society, clutched his notepad as if it were a lifeline, his earlier skepticism replaced by a profound, almost reverent shock. He had come expecting vague accusations, not a living ledger of human suffering. Silas's downfall was swift and catastrophic. Caldwell, armed with Samuel's undeniable testimony, did not hesitate. Within days, word of the Silas Plantation's atrocities spread like wildfire, carried by Caldwell and the few brave souls who had witnessed Samuel's act. Creditors, already wary of Silas's erratic behavior and declining fortunes, immediately pulled their investments, demanding repayment. Potential buyers, once eager for a piece of the sprawling estate, vanished. The very ground beneath Silas's feet seemed to dissolve. His reputation, once built on the shaky foundations of inherited wealth and social standing, crumbled into dust. He was no longer merely a harsh master. He was a monster, a systematic perpetrator of cruelty. His self-justifications reduced to ashes by the undeniable truth of Samuel's words. The whispers in the wider community turned into shouts of condemnation. Social ostracism was immediate and absolute, his name synonymous with depravity. Legal ramifications, though slow in coming in that era, were promised. A dark cloud gathering on his horizon. The once proud Silas Plantation became a pariah, a monument to a shattered lie. For the enslaved community, the aftermath was a complex tapestry of emotions. There was profound grief for the remembered, a fresh wave of sorrow for Sarah, for Thomas, for every soul Samuel had called forth from the depths of his memory. Tears flowed freely, but this time they were not just tears of despair. There was also a powerful awe for Samuel, a quiet boy who had somehow become their voice, their living history. He was no longer just a boy, he was a prophet, a living archive, a symbol of resilience that transcended their immediate suffering. His act ignited a spirit of defiance and a palpable sense of collective identity and agency. The knowledge that their losses had been seen, remembered, and articulated with such clarity gave them a strength they hadn't realized they possessed. Hope, long dormant, flickered to life, spreading like embers from the Silas Plantation to neighboring communities. Stories of the boy who remembered everything traveled with astonishing speed, inspiring hushed conversations and secret plans. Samuel's courageous act led directly to his freedom and that of his remaining family. Mr. Caldwell, deeply moved and understanding the immense importance of Samuel's testimony, ensured their safe passage away from the crumbling Silas estate. Samuel, his mother, and Mama Rose, who looked at him with an unutterable pride, embarked on a new, terrifying, yet hopeful journey. His testimony, now widely known among abolitionist circles, became a powerful tool in their fight. Samuel, still quiet but now with an undeniable gravitas, began to travel, sharing his story not as a spectacle, but as a solemn duty. He spoke in hushed meeting rooms, in small churches, to groups of impassioned activists, his voice clear and resonant as he recounted the names, the dates, the prices, the heart-wrenching details of lives stolen. He assisted in the identification of other lost individuals, his memory a bridge across the chasm of despair. He became a living testament against the horrors of slavery, his existence a constant, irrefutable argument for freedom. The justice Samuel achieved was not revenge, not in the vengeful sense of the word. It was a profound, undeniable act of truth-telling. It was the dismantling of the oppressor's narrative, the shattering of the comfortable lies that fueled the institution of slavery. It was the restoration of dignity and memory to the lost, to those who had been reduced to commodities, their very existence erased from official records. Samuel dedicated his life to this sacred work of remembrance. He helped establish nascent records, working tirelessly with abolitionist organizations to document the lives of the enslaved, to create an alternative history that honored their humanity. He spoke at gatherings, his quiet demeanor belying the immense power of his words, ensuring that the names and stories of those sold, those forgotten, were never truly lost. He understood that true freedom began with truth, and that memory was its most potent guardian. Years turned into decades. Samuel grew into an old man, his face etched with the wisdom of a life dedicated to bearing witness. He never forgot a single name, a single face, a single tear. His mind remained a pristine ledger, not of pain but of enduring human spirit. He saw the slow, arduous march towards emancipation, the Civil War, and the complex, often heartbreaking, aftermath. Through it all, he remained a steadfast beacon, a reminder that the past, however painful, must never be forgotten if a just future is to be built. His children and grandchildren learned his stories, understanding the immense burden and extraordinary gift he carried. They saw in his quiet resolve the true strength of a people who had endured unimaginable suffering, yet found a way to reclaim their humanity, one remembered name at a time. The legacy of the Silas Plantation, once a symbol of brutal power, became instead a testament to the boy who refused to let the past be silenced. Samuel's journey, from a silent, watchful child to a revered elder, was a testament to the enduring power of memory, the quiet strength of the oppressed, and how one boy's extraordinary gift fundamentally altered the course of justice, leaving an indelible mark on history and reminding generations that every life, every story, deserves to be remembered. His final breath was a quiet sigh, a life's work completed, a legacy of truth imprinted on the very fabric of time. The sun beat down on the Silas Plantation with merciless intensity, baking the earth to a cracked, dusty brown. It was a day etched in the collective memory of those who toiled under Mr. Silas's whip, a day heavy with the scent of sweat, fear, and the acrid tang of injustice. A somber crowd had gathered near the main house, their faces a tapestry of grief and resignation. At the center of this tableau stood Samuel, a boy barely 7 years old, his small frame seemingly swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. His gaze, unnervingly steady for one so young, was fixed on a woman being dragged away. Sarah, her name was. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, was now ripped and stained with dirt, a testament to the brutal hands that held her captive. Slave traders, their faces hardened by years of trafficking in human misery, surrounded her. Mr. Silas, perched on the porch like a malevolent king, barked orders, his voice a callous rasp that cut through the stifled sobs of the crowd. Sarah's cries for her child, a plea ripped from the depths of her soul, echoed across the parched fields. "Samuel, my Samuel." But Samuel remained motionless, his expression a mask of calm that belied the storm raging within. His eyes, wide and unblinking, absorbed every minute detail. The precise shade of brown of the trader's calloused hands, the tear in Sarah's dress exposing a patch of sunburnt skin, the glint of gold exchanging hands as Mr. Silas finalized the transaction. He etched the master's words into his mind, each syllable a nail hammered into the coffin of Sarah's freedom. "She's no longer my concern. Take her and be done with it." While others wept openly, their grief a raw and visceral expression of loss, Samuel's stillness was profound. It wasn't indifference, it was a strategic calm, a coping mechanism forged in the crucible of constant trauma. His mind, a pristine ledger, automatically inscribed the event with unwavering accuracy. It was as if his brain was a camera, capturing every sight, sound, and emotion, storing them away in a hidden archive. He wasn't just witnessing Sarah's sale, he was recording it, preserving it, making it indelible. The immediate aftermath was subtle, almost imperceptible. As Sarah was loaded onto the back of a wagon, her cries fading into the distance, Samuel retreated to a quiet corner of the yard near the base of an ancient oak tree. He didn't cry. Instead, he picked up a small twig and began to meticulously trace patterns in the dirt, concentric circles that spiraled inward, a silent ritual of internalizing the loss. Each circle represented a layer of grief, a layer of memory, a layer of resolve. With each stroke, a new entry was added to his burgeoning secret mental catalog of the disappeared. He remembered the exact price Sarah was sold for, the trader's name, a man with a scar above his left eye, and the direction the wagon had traveled. These details, seemingly insignificant to others, were precious fragments of a shattered life, fragments that Samuel vowed to preserve. Mr. Silas, oblivious to the extraordinary gift that lay dormant within the boy, merely glanced at him with indifference. He saw a quiet, unremarkable child, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. He could not perceive the intricate workings of the mind beneath the calm facade, the burgeoning archive of injustice that was slowly taking shape. He saw a blank slate where there was, in fact, a rapidly filling book of names, dates, and transgressions. Little did the master know the silent boy was not merely witnessing their cruelty. He was building a meticulous archive of their every transgression, one soul at a time. He was becoming a living testament to the suffering of his people, a walking, talking record of their stolen lives. As the shadows lengthened and the sun began its descent, Samuel finally looked up. His gaze swept across the vast, oppressive sky, a sky that seemed to bear witness to all the injustices committed beneath it. In his eyes there was a flicker of something unreadable, a nascent resolve, a silent promise, a spark of defiance that belied his tender age. The true weight of his gift, and the profound impact it would have on the future, remained a terrifying, unwritten future. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. The Silas Plantation was not merely a patch of land in the unforgiving American South. It was a universe unto itself, a brutal cosmos governed by the sun's relentless tyranny and Mr. Silas's unyielding will. Life here was a ceaseless, back-breaking cycle, dictated by the demands of cotton. From the first blush of dawn, when the sky was still bruised purple and gray, the mournful call of the overseer's horn sliced through the humid air, rousing every soul from the crude, cramped cabins of the slave quarters. The day was a relentless march through the fields, bent double under the scorching sun, fingers raw and bleeding from plucking the sharp bolls. The air hung thick with the scent of earth, sweat, and unspoken despair. There was no respite, no true break from the toil. Even the midday meal, a meager ration of cornmeal and salt pork, was eaten quickly, fueling bodies for the afternoon's renewed assault on the endless rows. The slave quarters, a cluster of dilapidated shacks huddled away from the grand, imposing plantation house, offered little comfort. Built from rough-hewn timber and mud, with thatched roofs that leaked in the torrential rains, they were barely more than shelters against the elements. Inside, families were crammed together, sharing what little warmth and solace they could find in the suffocating darkness. There was no privacy, no true sanctuary. Every sound, every whispered prayer, every stifled sob was heard by neighbors. The rigid social hierarchy of the plantation was a constant, oppressive force. Mr. Silas, the undisputed master, rarely ventured into the fields, preferring to issue his commands from the cool shade of his veranda. His will was enforced by a cadre of overseers, often poor white men driven by their own desperation and a twisted sense of superiority, and by a few trusted drivers from among the enslaved, whose unenviable task was to maintain order and productivity, often at great personal cost and moral compromise. These drivers walked a perilous tightrope, caught between the brutal demands of the master and the silent resentment of their own people. The lash was a frequent, agonizing reminder of who held power, its whistle and crack echoing across the fields, a chilling soundtrack to their existence. Yet, even within this crucible of suffering, a vibrant, resilient culture thrived in the hidden corners of the Silas plantation. It was a culture born of necessity, forged in the fires of oppression, but brimming with an indomitable spirit. In the quiet evenings, after the last field hand had stumbled back to their cabin, weary to their bones, the sounds of shared stories would begin to drift through the quarters. Tales of ancestral lands, of cunning tricksters and powerful spirits, passed down from generation to generation, woven with threads of hope and defiance. Spirituals sung in hushed, soulful tones became a language of their own, a clandestine code of sorrow, longing, and unwavering faith. These songs, often laden with double meanings, spoke of a promised land, of freedom, of a God who saw their suffering and would one day deliver them. They were a balm for wounded souls, a communal prayer that transcended the physical chains. Familial and communal bonds were not just cherished, they were meticulously, fiercely maintained, despite the ever-present threat of separation. Mothers taught their children the ancient ways, grandmothers shared the wisdom of their elders, and neighbors looked out for one another, sharing meager rations, nursing the sick, and offering a comforting hand in times of grief. These connections were the bedrock of their survival, the invisible chains that bound them together in defiance of the master's attempts to atomize their lives. Samuel, even at his tender age, was a quiet observer of this intricate web of resilience. His own mother, a woman named Ilara, possessed a quiet strength that belied her delicate frame. Her hands, though calloused from endless toil, were gentle when they cradled him. Her voice a soft melody when she sang him to sleep. She embodied the protective love and quiet fortitude that characterized so many of the women in their community, shielding her son from the worst of the plantation's brutalities, while instilling in him a deep reverence for their shared heritage. She was his anchor, his first and most profound teacher of resilience. It was within this crucible of harsh reality and profound communal resilience that Samuel's extraordinary gift began to manifest, initially as a curious anomaly in his early childhood. It wasn't merely a photographic recall of facts, though that was certainly part of it. His memory was something far more profound, an eidetic faculty that absorbed not just the visual and auditory details of an event, but also the emotional imprints, the subtle nuances of tone in a voice, the specific scent of the air during a particular moment, the precise quality of light. He remembered the exact way the dust swirling around Sarah's feet as she was led away, the specific tremor in her voice as she cried for her child, the cloying sweetness of the honeysuckle that bloomed near the auction block that day. These weren't just memories, they were visceral, full-sensory recreations of the past, as vivid and immediate as the present. At first, this gift was a source of wonder, a private marvel. He could recall stories told by the elders with perfect accuracy, mimicking their inflections, remembering every detail of their narratives. His mother would marvel at his ability to remember where she'd hidden a small trinket months ago, or the exact words of a spiritual sung only once. But as he grew older, and as the routine brutality of slavery became a more frequent spectacle, this unique gift quickly transformed into an unbearable burden. Every sale, every punishment, every casual act of dehumanization was inscribed onto his mind with terrifying permanence. The faces of those sold away, the dates of their departure, the prices they fetched, the callous words of Mr. Silas, all were stored, pristine and unalterable, in his mental archive. He saw the pain in the eyes of the grieving, heard the desperate pleas, felt the collective despair, and remembered it all with a clarity that offered no escape. Mr. Silas, the master of this domain, was a man of contradictions, or perhaps simply a man whose self-perception was utterly divorced from reality. He saw himself as a benevolent patriarch, a provider for his people, despite the undeniable evidence of his own cruelty. He would preach sermons on Sundays about Christian charity, even as he approved the sale of families on Mondays. His dismissive attitude towards the enslaved was deeply ingrained, viewing them as property, as cogs in the vast machinery of his cotton empire, rather than as human beings with souls and feelings. He rarely engaged with them directly, preferring to maintain a distant, imperious presence. Yet early interactions, even the most fleeting ones, sometimes stirred a subtle, unarticulated unease within him regarding Samuel. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the boy's quiet, watchful demeanor, his unnervingly still gaze that seemed to absorb everything without betraying a single emotion, occasionally pricked at the master's subconscious. Silas would often catch Samuel's eyes across a crowded yard, or see him standing silently at the edge of a group, an almost preternatural calm about him. He dismissed it as the quietude of a simple child, yet a faint, persistent shadow of discomfort lingered, a feeling that something about that boy was different, though he lacked the capacity or desire to understand what it might be. Samuel's silent presence at every critical moment, every tearful departure, every transaction of human flesh, began to cast an unspoken shadow over Mr. Silas, a shadow he was completely oblivious to, but one that was meticulously documented, detail by excruciating detail, in the boy's infallible mind. The master, in his arrogance, never once considered that the quiet child might be more than just a witness. He was a living, breathing ledger of every single one of his transgressions. The Silas plantation was not merely a property. It was a monument to generations of calculated cruelty, a sprawling testament to wealth forged in the crucible of human suffering. Its very foundations were steeped in a dark, persistent legacy, passed down like an heirloom, each successive Silas heir adding another layer of hardened indifference to the family's brutal inheritance. The original patriarch, an ambitious man named Elias Silas, had arrived in the fertile lands of the American South with little more than a keen business sense and a chilling conviction in the righteousness of his enterprise. He had justified the enslavement of human beings with convenient interpretations of Scripture and the prevailing economic dogma of the era, convincing himself and his peers that these people were mere chattel, necessary cogs in the grand machinery of agricultural prosperity. This self-serving ideology had not softened with time. Rather, it had calcified, transforming into a deeply entrenched moral blindness that allowed his descendants, including Mr. Silas, to perpetuate unspeakable acts without a flicker of genuine remorse. The plantation itself, with its sprawling fields of cotton stretching endlessly under the unforgiving sun, its imposing main house and the ramshackle slave quarters, was an ecosystem built on imbalance, sustained by the constant threat of violence and the systematic dehumanization of its workforce. It was a world where human lives were meticulously weighed against market prices, where familial bonds were considered liabilities, and where the pursuit of profit eclipsed all semblance of compassion. This was the dark soil from which Samuel's unique gift had sprung, a desperate countermeasure against an institution designed to erase identity and memory, a silent rebellion against the tyranny of forgetting. Samuel's internal ledger, once a nascent curiosity, now expanded with terrifying rapidity, each new entry a fresh wound inflicted upon his community, and by extension, upon his own sensitive soul. The sales were not isolated tragic events. They were a systemic pattern, a relentless culling driven by economics, whim, or punishment. He remembered the infant Ilara, barely 6 months old, a tiny bundle of innocence torn from her mother's breast, her desperate, gasping cries echoing as she was passed into the rough hands of a trader named Bartholomew, bound for the rice fields of Georgia. Samuel had been perhaps 8 then, hidden behind a rain barrel, his small frame trembling as he absorbed every detail. The trader's pockmarked face, the clinking of coins, the exact words Mr. Silas had used to dismiss the weeping mother. "She'll fetch a good price, Martha, and you're needed in the fields." He recalled the stoic, almost serene expression of old man Josiah, a revered elder who had seen 3 generations of Silas masters sold away at the age of 72 because his hands, gnarled and arthritic, could no longer pick cotton with the required speed. Josiah had been destined for a smaller, less demanding farm in Alabama, a place where he would likely die alone, far from the only home he had ever known. Samuel had seen the flash of Mr. A. Silas's gold watch as he checked the time, impatient to conclude the transaction, the casual wave of his hand that condemned a lifetime of loyalty. The young boy meticulously noted the precise routes of the traders, their destinations, the types of wagons they used, the number of horses, the brand of their whips, the cumulative pain of the community, a thick, suffocating blanket of grief, settled deep within Samuel, and his silent, perfect absorption of it became both a burden and a sacred duty, a relentless pressure that forged his spirit even as it weighed him down. His family, particularly his watchful mother, began to observe Samuel with a mixture of concern and an unspoken, dawning understanding. They saw his quiet intensity, the way his eyes seemed to hold more than a child's comprehension, especially after a sale. They tried to shield him from the worst, whispering hushed warnings when traders were rumored to be near, inventing chores that would keep him away from the main house during negotiations. Yet they also, almost inadvertently, began to rely on his uncanny ability. "Samuel," his mother would ask in a voice barely above a whisper, her eyes full of a longing that transcended words, "do you remember? Do you remember when little Thomas was sold? What was the name of the man who took him?" And Samuel, without hesitation, would provide the details. The man's name, the date, the color of his coat, the price. He was not just remembering, he was giving voice to the voiceless, holding on to fragments of lives that others desperately feared would vanish into the cruel currents of time. He became the unofficial, living archive of the enslaved community's history, the keeper of their stolen kin, the meticulous chronicler of their profound losses. This unspoken role deepened his already introspective nature, burdening his young shoulders with an immense responsibility that few could ever comprehend. He felt the weight of every remembered name, every broken family, every tear shed, as if each had been physically etched into his very being, shaping his very perception of the world. As Samuel grew, so too did Mr. Silas's indifference, hardening into an undeniable cruelty that seemed to expand with each passing season. Economic pressures, perhaps a poor harvest or a dip in cotton prices, often fueled his escalating moral decay. He would break promises with chilling casualness, especially those concerning family unity. He had once pledged to Sarah, a young woman with a sickly child, that she and her boy would never be separated, only to sell the child a month later to cover a debt, dismissing Sarah's heartbroken pleas with a cold, dismissive wave. Samuel, hidden in the shadows of the stable, had memorized the exact words of the broken vow, the precise tremor in Sarah's voice, the unfeeling clatter of the coins. New, harsher punishments became commonplace for minor infractions. A driver named Jebediah, known for his particularly brutal temper, was given free rein to motivate the workforce, his whip cracking with increasing frequency. Mr. Silas's justifications for these acts grew more convoluted, more self-serving, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. He would cite biblical passages out of context, or drone on about the burden of his property. Each broken promise, each new lash, each act of dehumanization was meticulously noted in Samuel's internal ledger, building not just a record of loss, but a damning, irrefutable case against the master, piece by painful piece. Samuel's quiet eyes missed nothing, his mind a silent, relentless witness to the unfolding tragedy, a living repository of the master's sins. The cumulative psychological toll of life on the Silas plantation weighed heavily on every soul, a suffocating blanket woven from generations of despair. Small, daily indignities, once shrugged off as unavoidable facets of their existence, now festered, escalating into profound disrespect that gnawed at the very core of their beings. It was in the casual dismissal of human suffering, the master's inability or unwillingness to even acknowledge the pain he inflicted, that the deepest wounds were dealt. A mother's tears for a child sold were met with a blank stare, a demand for more work. A father's plea for a moment of rest after a grueling day was answered with a whip or a threat of harsher labor. The arbitrary assignment of tasks, often designed not for efficiency but for humiliation, stripped them of any semblance of autonomy. One day, a skilled carpenter might be forced to mend fences, while a strong field hand was made to sweep the master's porch. Both tasks beneath their true capabilities, both meant to remind them of their utter powerlessness. The constant, insidious threat of separation loomed perpetually, a dark cloud that never truly dissipated. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of fragile joy was underscored by the unspoken terror that it could be their last together. Families, already fractured by previous sales, lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, never knowing when the next decree from the main house would shatter their world anew. This relentless psychological warfare, far more pervasive than the physical beatings, slowly, agonizingly eroded their hope and dignity. It chipped away at their spirits, leaving behind a hollow ache that echoed through the slave quarters each night. They were taught, through every action and inaction, that their lives, their feelings, their very humanity held no value in the eyes of their enslavers. The vibrant culture that once offered solace now struggled to breathe under the oppressive weight, its songs growing softer, its stories whispered with greater caution, as if the very act of remembrance could be deemed an act of defiance. Yet even in this crushing environment, a flicker of something stubbornly human persisted, a quiet resilience born from shared suffering and an enduring, desperate need to simply be. Samuel, now on the precipice of young adolescence, felt this collective despair and simmering anger with an intensity that threatened to consume him. His gift, once a silent ledger, had become a roaring torrent, each memory a fresh wave crashing against the fragile shores of his youthful mind. He grappled with the immense, suffocating weight of his memories, a burden that few, if any, could truly comprehend. The names and faces in his internal archive, once distinct entries, now merged into an endless, agonizing procession. Each one was a stark, undeniable reminder of injustice, a testament to the systematic cruelty he had witnessed since childhood. He saw the faces of infants sold, their mothers' cries still echoing in his mind. He recalled the proud stoic faces of men and women, broken by the lash or by the sale of their loved ones, their dignity slowly stripped away. The sheer volume of suffering threatened to overwhelm him, to drown him in a sea of sorrow. There were moments, late at night, when the images would flash behind his closed eyelids, a relentless panorama of pain that stole his sleep. He would clench his fists, his body trembling with a potent cocktail of grief and rage. The powerful urge to speak out, to unleash the torrent of truth that resided within him, surged through his veins. He imagined himself standing before Mr. Silas, reciting every detail, every name, every date, every broken promise, watching the master's smug facade crumble under the weight of irrefutable evidence. He yearned to give voice to the voiceless, to demand justice for the forgotten. But always, a chilling counter-thought would rise, a stark reminder of the immense danger such an act would pose, not just to himself, a young boy whose defiance would be met with swift, brutal retribution, but to his mother, his grandmother, and the entire community he cherished. He understood the precarious balance of their lives, the fragile thread by which their existence hung. One wrong word, one act of overt rebellion, and everything could be lost, shattered beyond repair. So he swallowed his words, choked down his rage, and continued to watch, to remember, to record, his silence becoming an increasingly heavy cloak. He was a vessel overflowing with truth, yet forbidden to pour it out, a silent scream trapped within a growing boy. Mr. Silas, oblivious to the internal inferno raging within Samuel, continued his reign with increasingly manipulative tactics. A master of psychological warfare cloaked in false piety, he understood the power of hope, however fleeting, and wielded it like a cruel instrument. He might feign benevolence with small, seemingly compassionate gestures, offering an extra ration of meager food after a particularly brutal week, or allowing a brief supervised visit between separated family members. These brief respites, designed to momentarily quell unrest, were always followed by acts of profound cruelty, making the initial kindness feel like a calculated deception. He would promise a family reunion if a certain quota of cotton was met, only to renege on his word, claiming unforeseen circumstances or a sudden debt. He used division and fear with insidious precision to maintain control, sowing discord among the enslaved individuals. He might subtly favor one driver over another, or commend one family's work ethic in front of others, creating jealousies and resentments that prevented true unity. He encouraged a climate of suspicion, making it difficult for trust to flourish, knowing that a divided community was easier to rule. Empty promises were his preferred currency, exchanged for temporary obedience. He would dangle the prospect of reduced labor, or even the chance for eventual freedom, before those he deemed particularly productive or compliant, knowing full well he had no intention of honoring such vows. These were not genuine offers, but carefully crafted illusions, designed to extract maximum effort while stifling any nascent thoughts of rebellion. Samuel, with his unnervingly precise memory, observed these patterns with chilling clarity. He saw through the thin veneer of Silas's feigned kindness, understanding the insidious, calculated nature of his power. Every false smile, every empty assurance, every divisive word was logged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced in Samuel's mind, building a comprehensive portrait of a man whose cruelty was as cunning as it was absolute. The boy knew that Silas's greatest weapon was not the whip, but the subtle erosion of hope, the systematic dismantling of the human spirit. While Samuel meticulously guarded the secret of his extraordinary gift, a profound silence surrounding his unique capacity for remembrance, the other enslaved people, through subtle cues and shared observations, began to sense his singular ability. They couldn't articulate it, couldn't explain it, but they felt it. His quiet presence at every sale, his knowing gaze that seemed to miss nothing, the way he would sometimes correct an elder's memory of a past event with startling accuracy. These instances, small on their own, accumulated into an unspoken understanding. He became a silent repository of their collective grief and history, a living testament to their stolen past. When a new child was born or an elder passed, there was an almost imperceptible shift in the way glances would drift toward Samuel, as if to ensure that this moment, too, would be preserved. He was the one who could recall the exact shade of a lost sister's scarf, the precise melody of a spiritual sung by a mother long gone, the very words spoken by a father before he was marched away. He remembered the small, intimate details that others, in their overwhelming sorrow, had allowed to fade. This made him a walking, breathing monument to their losses, a silent promise that their loved ones, though physically absent, would not be forgotten entirely. He carried their collective memory, their pain, their enduring love, a sacred trust bestowed upon him without a single word ever needing to be spoken. His burden was immense, but so too was the quiet reverence and unspoken dependence the community placed upon him. He was their history keeper, their archivist of souls, a living testament to their stolen past, a silent, unwavering promise that their losses would not be forgotten, that one day, perhaps, the truth he held would find its voice, shattering the silence and demanding an accounting for every single soul that had vanished into the cruel annals of the Silas plantation. The years bled into one another, each one deepening the grooves of hardship on the Silas plantation. Samuel, now a young man whose quiet intensity had only sharpened with age, watched as the master's cruelty, once a slow, seeping poison, began to erupt like a festering wound. Mounting financial difficulties, a relentless tide that seemed to rise with every passing season, drove Mr. Silas to new, terrifying depths of desperation. A blight had swept through the cotton fields 2 summers prior, shriveling the bolls and decimating the harvest. Then the market prices for what little yield remained plummeted, leaving Silas's ledgers awash in red ink. His once grand home, though still imposing, began to show subtle signs of neglect. A faded curtain here, a peeling paint chip there, mirroring the decay within its owner. This economic pressure transformed Mr. Silas from merely indifferent to truly ruthless. The threats of more sales became a daily, chilling refrain, not just for minor infractions, but as a casual warning, a sword perpetually hanging over every head. He implemented stricter, often brutal measures to extract every last ounce of labor from his dwindling workforce. Rations were cut, the already meager meals becoming even sparser, leaving gnawing hunger in the bellies of the enslaved. Workdays stretched from before dawn until long after dusk, illuminated only by flickering lanterns that cast long, grotesque shadows across the fields. The whip of Jebediah, the brutal driver, cracked with a new, frantic urgency, a sound that echoed the master's own escalating panic. The pressure on the enslaved community intensified dramatically, a suffocating blanket of fear and exhaustion that pressed down on every soul. Each sunrise brought not hope, but a renewed dread of what new indignity or separation the day might unleash. As Mr. Silas's behavior grew more erratic and cruel, it did not go unnoticed by the wider community. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the dusty roads, began to circulate among neighboring plantation owners. They spoke of Silas's increasingly harsh hand, his unpredictable temper, and the unsettling frequency with which he sold off his enslaved people, often for less than market value in his haste. Overseers from adjacent properties who once shared drinks and stories with Silas now avoided his company, their eyes holding a subtle disdain, a silent judgment for his instability and lack of control. Even the itinerant slave traders, hardened men accustomed to the brutal commerce, began to view Silas with a wary eye, seeing him as a desperate man, easy to exploit in his financial straits, but also a potential liability, a source of trouble. Direct intervention was rare, for such was the nature of their society, but the subtle isolation, the averted gazes, the hushed conversations that ceased abruptly upon his approach, began to subtly erode his standing. These unspoken judgments, though silent, contributed to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that hung over the Silas plantation, a cloud of disapproval and foreboding that permeated the very air. Silas, in his escalating tyranny, was not only alienating his human property, but also isolating himself within his own social sphere, becoming a pariah among his peers, a man whose desperation made him both dangerous and pitiable. Samuel, now a man on the cusp of adulthood, his frame lean and strong from years of labor, felt the tremors of this shifting landscape more acutely than anyone. The weight of his memories, once a burden he merely carried, began to transform within him. He started to understand the potential power of his gift beyond mere remembrance, beyond being a living archive of loss. He realized it could be a tool for justice, a weapon against the injustice he had meticulously documented over nearly 2 decades. His mind, a vast, intricate tapestry of names, dates, faces, and prices, held the undeniable truth of Mr. Silas's transgressions. He saw the patterns in the master's cruelty, the calculated deceptions, the broken promises that had become a hallmark of his reign. A silent plan began to formulate in the quiet chambers of his mind, a slow, deliberate unfolding of purpose. He found subtle ways to verify fragments of his knowledge, testing the waters, observing reactions. He might mention a detail about a long-gone relative in a hushed conversation with an elder, watching their eyes widen in recognition, confirming the accuracy of his internal ledger. He might subtly allude to a specific trade, a date, or a name, without revealing the full extent of his extraordinary gift, gauging the impact of such precise recall. This was not just about remembering anymore. It was about preparing, about honing a weapon forged from truth and suffering, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The silent archivist was slowly, inexorably, becoming a strategist. The psychological environment on the plantation became almost unbearable, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that pressed down on every living thing. Hope, once a flickering ember in the darkest corners of the slave quarters, dwindled to barely a wisp, replaced by a pervasive sense of fear, resentment, and impending doom. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken grief and simmering anger. Every creak of the main house, every distant shout, sent shivers of apprehension through the community. Samuel's presence, though still largely silent, became an unsettling constant reminder to Mr. Silas of his actions. Even if Silas could not articulate why the young man's watchful gaze disturbed him so profoundly, the master would sometimes catch Samuel's eyes across the fields or in the slave quarters, a momentary connection that seemed to pierce through Silas's self-delusions. There was no defiance in Samuel's look, no open challenge, just an unnerving clarity, a profound knowing that made Silas's skin crawl. He dismissed it as insolence, as a trick of his own frayed nerves. But the feeling persisted. The boy saw him, truly saw him, in a way no other enslaved person ever had. The plantation, with its mounting debt, its desperate master, its brutalized community, and its silent, all-remembering witness, was no longer just a place of suffering. It was a powder keg, primed and ready to ignite, needing only a spark to explode into a maelstrom of truth and consequence. The relentless pressures on Mr. Silas, both external and internal, finally pushed him beyond the brink of any semblance of humanity, revealing the true depths of his desperation and hardening cruelty. The poor harvests continued, compounding his financial woes, and the whispers of his instability from neighboring plantations had solidified into outright avoidance. Creditors began to circle like vultures, their patience worn thin by his evasiveness and increasingly erratic behavior. In a desperate, cornered animal frenzy, Silas committed a series of acts so egregious they ripped away any remaining shred of loyalty, or even grudging respect from those around him. He threatened to sell not just field hands, but the house servants, individuals who had served his family for generations, their faces etched with horror and disbelief. The ultimate blow, however, came when he announced, in a fit of rage after a particularly bad ledger report, that he would be selling Samuel's mother, Eliza. He declared it publicly, during the meager evening meal, his voice raw with a chilling blend of fear and spite. Eliza, a woman whose quiet strength had been the backbone of the slave quarters, whose hands had tended to Silas's own children, stood frozen, her eyes wide with a terror that ripped through Samuel's very soul. This was not just a threat, it was an act of pure, unadulterated malice, designed to break the spirit of the entire community, to assert his absolute, tyrannical control in the face of his own crumbling empire. The air grew thick with a suffocating dread, the collective gasp of the enslaved community, a raw wound in the night. Even Jebediah, the brutal overseer, shifted uncomfortably, his usual swagger replaced by a flicker of unease. Silas had crossed a line, a sacred unspoken boundary that even the most hardened masters often hesitated to breach. He,